To lecture 2 of General Biology 115. This lecture is entitled The Scientific Process and Chemistry. We're going to be going over both the scientific process and some basic chemistry. And to begin, let's look at what the scientific process is. So we'll start off with the scientific process. Something we've heard a lot as students, especially in high school and any biology course that we've taken. It's important to understand this process because it helps us figure out what science is really all about. So let's talk about science very quickly. So science. This is going to be the most general part of a flowchart you will ever see in this course, but science is not rigid. It often gets a bad rap of being sort of full of laws. It's actually very flexible, full of laws and things that never change. Science is one of the most easily adaptable and changing things, much like in our Lecture 1 series when we talked about the brain. The brain was something that had plasticity. Science is also very similar in that sense. It is not rigid, it is flexible, it is always changing. And so science is all about this idea of to know. People want to know things. They want to understand the world around them. This is known as inquiry. People ask questions. People are curious. And what do they do based on this curiosity? They make observations. Scientists make observations, and scientists also make measurements. As they make these observations, as they make these measurements, they develop systematic patterns. We call them systematic patterns that help the scientists do science. It helps the scientists understand the world around them. So that's what science is in a nutshell. But more so, we want to look at the process of it. And scientific process consists of what is known as inductive discovery. And I'm going to draw that down here. Inductive discovery. What does that mean? Inductive discovery is essentially when a scientist gathers observations. We're going to gather observations. Remember how I said there's observations right here as a part of this inquiry process? And once you take those observations, you're going to inductively create conclusions based off of those observations. And another way to look at this is that when doing science, so you're going to be looking at and taking down lots of observations. And what are you going to do? You're going to take those big, broad observations and you're going to make generalizations. A good example of this, to sort of understand inductive reasoning a little bit better, is the idea of the human genome. When we sequence the human genome, and what does that mean? The sequencing of human genome. When we looked at our entire genetic makeup, the human is considered full of genes. It has so many genes, the human body. So what we did was we sequenced it. We figured out what every single gene does. This was inductive reasoning. We took something that had lots and lots of observations about it. The human genome has always been studied for a long time. And what did we do? We came up with some general conclusions about it. We took the sequence of the human genome, and what did we do? We made a description of every human gene. We took it and we described it. We made a description of human genes. Notice what we did. This process was inductive because we took observations, we took the human genome observations, and we created conclusions. We described every single human gene known. This was inductive reasoning. This is what science is about. And so we can apply this knowledge of science and inductive reasoning to the actual process. The actual process, we call it the scientific process or the scientific method. You might have heard of it as. It involves about 5 steps. Step 1, we've mentioned it right now, it's the idea of observing things or looking for, let's say, a problem even, or a pattern. These are things that a scientist gets curious about. Because remember, at the heart of science is curiosity. It's this want to know things. And that's what good scientists have. So what do? They make observations. They find a problem or think of a problem, and then they think maybe there's a pattern somewhere here. And what do you do after this? You go out and you do step 2, which is gather some background information. You go out and you figure, what else am I missing? What else do I need to know before I can figure out a reason for this observation, a reason for this problem or pattern? And once you've gathered that background information, you now have this great ability to develop a hypothesis. Now, we've all heard of the term hypothesis before, and you can probably say it's an educated guess, but a better way of describing it, especially at the college level, I think, is this. We can call a hypothesis a proposed tentative. What does tentative mean? It means not stable, not the same. It can change. Remember, science is rigid, not rigid, it's flexible. There it is. Proposed tentative explanation. This is a better way, in my opinion, of saying educated guess. It's a proposed tentative explanation. It's built via inductive reasoning. Remember how we talked about inductive reasoning? What did we do? We took observations. Look what we have here. Observations. We have some background information. And what did we end up with? Conclusions or generalizations. That's exactly what a hypothesis is. It's taking those observations you made and concluding something, creating an explanation out of those observations. Another thing about a hypothesis is that it's falsifiable. What does that mean? Falsifiable means that it has the ability to be proven both wrong and right. It can be falsified. So you can't just assume that every hypothesis is correct. The great thing about science is that it has the ability to be wrong, yet we can go back and change our hypothesis and change the way that we look at something so that we can sort of create a better experiment, let's say. And so these are the three things that give us a great hypothesis, and we just want to remember that this development of a hypothesis is heavily reliant on these observations. This proposed tentative explanation is heavily reliant on this, and obviously this as well, and this is what's going to give us that whole idea of, let's say that, we'll put this in quotes here, the educated guess that a hypothesis usually is considered. Educated guess. Good way to summarize everything. So we've done observations, we got some background information, we made a hypothesis. What's next? The next thing to do is deductive reasoning. And I'm going to do that right over here, step 4. Deductive reasoning. So we've induced in terms of our reasoning. Now we're going to deduce, if that's the right term. We're going to undergo deductive reasoning. What does this mean? Deductive reasoning is basically when we go from general to specific. A good way to look at this is an example, and this example is the idea of being human. I'm going to deduce something out of being human. What I know as a scientist, and this is called a premise, we have a premise involved here. I have a premise that's going to turn into a prediction about humans. My premise is that I know that all organisms are made of cells. And I also know that humans are organisms. Those are my two premises. All organisms are made of cells, check 1, and then humans are organisms, check 2. My prediction based off of this is that because all organisms are made of cells and humans are organisms, humans are made up of cells. And that is deductive reasoning. Taking that general information, creating those premises, and creating a strong prediction based off of those premises. That's also part of the scientific method. That's after we've developed our hypothesis. And then lastly, of course, in terms of science, number 5, is to do the fun part, is to go do the experiment as a scientist. Go out there and test your predictions. That's the best part of this. In General Biology 115, you won't be doing this, nor will you be doing this in General Biology 116, Gen Bio 1 or 2. You're going to be doing this, I believe, in Gen 117, Gen Bio 117. That's General Biology Lab. You're going to actually be testing predictions, doing experiments, and completing the scientific process or method. So overall, we can look at science as this very flexible, non-rigid structure that's all about knowing, figuring out why things happen based off of observations. And these observations give us some conclusions known as inductive conclusions. Inductive reasoning happens here in the science. And then we use this inductive reasoning, we go back and we do the process. We have to go through a stepwise process of making observations, maybe even finding a problem, something's interesting that you want to fix, a pattern. You gather some more background information, and then you develop a strong hypothesis. A hypothesis is otherwise just a proposed tentative explanation, something that's an educated guess that can be proven wrong, and that uses that inductive reasoning that we mentioned. Once we've done that, we have the ability to deduce certain things. We deduce certain things by making predictions based off of knowledge that we already have, some premises that we already have. And then obviously, finally, we go out and do the experiment, test our predictions, and go back to see if if our hypothesis was either supported or not supported. We don't like to say hypothesis was right or wrong, simply because of the fact that that right or wrong could have happened for whatever reason, some random reason. We just like to say it's supported or not supported as scientists. So this is the scientific process as a whole. In our next video, we'll look at the language of science very briefly, and then we'll start chemistry.